The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
Asly, thank you for being with us and thank you for taking my questions. Large infrastructure projects, two of them mentioned in the comments that we have been listening right now, Anaklia and also Namakhwani. Both of these projects are quite problematic. Do you think the taxpayer money involvement could balance those problems that are associated with these projects, with their investors and ongoing disputes?
I don't believe that the taxpayers' money should be used to finance any project. We believe that private investors should invest, but using the money of the taxpayers, whether those are taxes collected or whether it is the money from the pension fund, which I believe this is what might be behind the mind of the authorities, would be a tragic mistake. Using the pension fund money to finance such projects will lead to the collapse of the pension fund. And therefore, this means that the money of all those people who have contributed to pension fund will evaporate. I don't think that it is the role of the government to invest, but I also understand that considering the 10 years performance of the government where they screwed every single foreign investor in the country, no one wants to touch Georgia anymore. And their only option now is to use the taxpayers' money to fund projects, which would be a terrible mistake.
You represent the largest international business community in Georgia. Do you and do the investors have precise answers why this project didn't work out in private hands?
Look, everyone knows that Anaklia was a political motivated destruction. This means that Mr. Kvanchilashvili on purpose destroyed the project by discrediting the investors, by creating false accusation against the Georgian investors. And the initial aim was to stop the project totally. I mean, Mr. Kvanchilashvili himself didn't believe in Anaklia as a project, even in 2011 when he was talking, when it was Lazika at that time, he didn't believe in it. But now the situation has changed because with the war between Ukraine and Russia, all the big economic powers are looking for an alternative route, which is this middle corridor that involves Georgia. And the volumes that will be transiting through Georgia will go up exponentially. And now Mr. Kvanchilashvili realized that there is an added value for Anaklia, and he is trying to secure the financing, which in my opinion will be impossible to secure through private investors unless those private investors are laundering Russian money or Mr. Kvanchilashvili's money. So that's why there is a big skepticism within the investment community regarding the financing of those big infrastructure projects.
Along the lines what we heard from Mr. Kobakhidze and Namakhwani and this whole register of foreign agents, Anaklia wasn't mentioned in this register. By the way, the U.S. Embassy in Georgia has been talking about some sort of screening mechanism for investors who will be investing in Georgia. But the current government and the ruling party seem to be keener on this foreign agents law. Where is the investment environment heading?
Look, the investment environment is heading nowhere. It is literally frozen. This year we'll probably have $2 billion of foreign direct investment according to the description of foreign direct investment by the Statistics Department. But if you look at this description, most of foreign investment are reinvestments. This means that those are companies that are mainly probably owned 10% by some offshore that qualifies as a foreign investor, that is not taking the profit out, that is keeping the profit in the country. This means this looks like an investment, but it's not a foreign investment. And then you have loans that are taken by the private sector from large financial institutions. They fall under foreign direct investment, but they are not. The real volume of investment is about 10 to 12%. This means about $200 million equity investment that comes from, Turks mainly and other investors. It's equity investment. So the real foreign direct investment in Georgia, if we have to look, is about $200 million, practically. So nothing is happening. There is no investment in the country, and especially now with this political instability, internal and external, no one will touch Georgia, unless, of course, it's China or Russia. Those are the two entities, the two countries, or the two sources of possible investment for infrastructure project in Georgia.
But we see some other types of investors, like more keen on IT, more keen on innovation, moving to Georgia, right? Because we see, for example, EPAM, which was on the list of foreign investors, and this is a Western investment. We were very happy to see them on the list.
Yes, IPAM is a U.S. registered company owned by a Belarusian gentleman whom I know pretty well. And it's fortunate to see them here. They moved out from Ukraine and from Belarus, their activities that brought them to Georgia. So I don't consider this to be an investment. It's more of an investment in human resources, which is good, and in technology and in know-how and in knowledge. But it's not per se an investment in capital, because, taking offices, I don't believe that renting office space can be considered as an investment, or buying laptops or computers. Yes, it is, but it is not like millions of dollars that are entering in the country from the IT. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying it's fantastic that we have this, but it does not create an economic momentum. It creates jobs, which is a very good thing, but it doesn't create like a real economic momentum.
Yes, could the candidate status, EU candidate status, help Georgia in this regard, also in drawing more Western, more institutional investments, what you were appealing to?
Definitely the candidate status will put Georgia on the map of serious foreign investors and Western investors, because having the candidate status is already a huge step forward. Being candidate will increase the GDP of Georgia by 50% within 2 years. We have seen it in Romania and Bulgaria. The very next 2 years that they became members of the European Union, the GDP increased in 2 years by 50% for the two countries. So definitely having the candidate status will be a kind of political card that the authorities can play to regain some credibility. But at the same time, we have a carrot, which is the candidate status, but we have a huge stick that is not being waved by the EU, that's being waved by the Georgian government with this law on foreign agents, okay? I always like to describe this as you have Russian agents who are creating a law against the non-Russian agents to being able to accuse them of being foreign agents.
You mentioned Bulgaria and how their GDP per capita rose, and how this well-being, economic well-being, is closely related with EU integration. But we heard from Mr. Kobakhidze that, for example, part of the migration, why migration happened in Georgia, was because of visa liberalization as well.
if you look at the statement of Mr. Kobakhidze, he says that between 2004 and 2012, 220,000 people left Georgia for the EU. At a time, he says in his statement that 25,000 people left to the EU since we had the visa liberalization, okay, which is a totally contradictory statement. This means that more people left to Georgia when there was no visa-free regime than when there is visa-free regime. Look, Mr. Kobakhidze is like permanently drunk. I mean, he's irresponsible for what he says. I mean, he can say anything that doesn't make sense. And honestly, it's very difficult to comment on gibberish and nonsense.
Okay, so let me ask you then, what are some of the main concerns that foreign investors that you have, that are members of ICC Georgia, what are some of the main concerns?
I will tell you, the main concern is that they feel that they are not wanted in Georgia. That's the main concern. You know, I mean, over the years, most of the foreign investors here that are not linked to the government, that don't have a partnership with the government, like Heidelberg Cement, for example, that is partially owned by the investment fund of Mr. Ivanishvili. So most of the investors who are not linked to the government had terrible problems here. They got defrauded by the courts. Whenever they had a court case, they lost systematically their court. They got racketeered by entities close to the government with the blessing of the government. They saw their residency permit cancelled or removed. They were rejected when they arrived at the airport like animals. And no one wants to touch Georgia anymore. I mean, no one believes in investment in Georgia. And when I see like some of the Georgian government officials going abroad and saying that Georgia is a paradise for investors, no one is a fool anymore. Maybe in 2013, 14, 15, people were fooled, but no one is fooled anymore. No one wants to touch Georgia. The only chance to have money now is to receive it from Russia or China. And beside that, no one serious will put money in the country.
How important is this word of mouth among foreign investors? When a new investor is coming to the country, would they try to talk to those investors who are also already doing business in Georgia? And what would be the impression they would get out of those talks?
You will always have investors who don't ask questions, okay? Or who hear a good story and who come because they heard a good story. I mean, you will always have such, but those are very small investors. But institutional investors, large investors, they know, okay? They're not idiots. They have their contacts, they have their intelligence. But many investors do speak to current investors here, and the feedback is always very negative. No, don't touch Georgia. I mean, we had problems, we still have problems, and it's never ending. So it's going to take years once this government changes and we have a good government to restore the image of Georgia as a favorable place for investment. Now only Russian money will come to Georgia and probably Chinese money. Beside that, you can forget maybe smaller investors from the Middle East, you know, who buy an apartment, who buy a piece of land, but nothing serious.
Do you think the business community should be more outspoken in these circumstances, considering what type of economic policy is the government exercising? When we see price caps, when we see regulations, direct, indirect, are you expect business to be more outspoken in general?
I will divide the businesses in two categories. You have, on one hand, the private sector that is working, businesses per se, and then you have business organizations. Businesses, you know, they focus on optimizing their revenues. So we shouldn't ask business people, individual business people, to take positions, policy positions that can affect their business because they are turning the government against them, okay? So this would be suicide for a business person to do this. However, business organizations who take responsibility for the business community should bear responsibility, should be involved in the policy making, should express their concern and their worries transparently and openly without fearing repercussions from the government, even if the chairs of those business organizations are business people themselves and that their open statements can affect their private businesses. If such is the case, then they should resign as chairs of the business organizations. So that's why it's important to differentiate between private businesses and leaders of the business community.
Thank you so much, Fady.